Okay, so today we worked on how to verify an identity, and you should have these tips that are listed on the screen on the pink piece of paper where we wrote the alternate forms of the Pythagorean identities. Verifying identities basically means proving how you get from the starting point to the end point. It's following logic to make your argument of why this is true. So you'll already have the answers. Your job is to show me how you get from the beginning to the end. So it's very critical that we see all work. Okay, so the tips that are given are some things you can try. You're only going to work with one side of the equation at a time. Sometimes if you have more than two functions, you want to use your identities to write things as sines or cosines. Okay, you can do some algebra, which includes adding fractions, multiplying, using distributive property. There's lots of different things that you can try. And also, it's very important that you know your identities, because those are the things you're going to use to substitute. If you don't recognize the identities, this is going to be much harder than it should be. Okay, also, the only thing you can do that's absolutely wrong is to try nothing. Even if you don't get all the way to the end of the problem, try something. I can give you partial credit if your steps make sense at all. Okay, so let's look at some examples. So the first problem says secant minus cosine is equal to sine times tangent. We're going to take just the left side of the problem, and we're going to work on that until we get sine times tangent. Okay, and notice on this problem they've given you some hints on the side. Not every problem is exactly the same, so you just have to practice lots of different types. Okay, so the first thing for secant minus cosine is we can use a reciprocal of secant, and the reciprocal for secant is 1 over the cosine. So I'm going to replace secant with 1 over cosine. And since that's a fraction, we wrote the other side as cosine over 1. Anytime you're subtracting fractions, you must have a common denominator, whether it's numbers, x's, trig functions. So let's do that. And the common denominator on this would be cosine. So I need to multiply the top and bottom of the second fraction times cosine. Okay, so that leaves me with 1 over cosine for the first fraction. And on the second one, cosine times cosine is cosine squared. 1 times cosine is cosine. And now that the denominators are the same, we can write this as one fraction. So if my common denominator was cosine of x, I'm going to leave that on the bottom. And on the top, I'm just going to write 1 minus cosine squared. Okay. Now remember, I'm trying to get sine times tangent for my answer. I don't have a sine or a tangent anywhere in this problem. Okay, but one hint is when you see a trig function that is squared, you should look at the Pythagorean identities. Okay, and if you have your pink page, then on the pink sheet you should see where it says sine squared equals 1 minus cosine squared. So we've got 1 minus cosine squared. Let's replace that with sine squared. Okay, so now it looks a little closer because at least we have a sine in the problem. Okay, but I just want sine times tangent. So instead of sine squared is the same thing as sine times sine. I'm going to split it back up. And then cosine is the same as 1 times cosine. You don't always have to do this. Remember, you're keeping one eye on where you want to end up. Okay, so sine over 1 is the same thing as sine of x. Sine over cosine is the same thing as tangent of x. And now that we've got the same thing that was on the right side to start with, we're finished. Sine times tangent. So again, it's the steps in the middle that are important, not the answer, because I've given you the answer. Okay, you do not always have to start on the left side. You pick the side you want to start on. On number 2, I would start on the left side, however, because there's a lot of functions there. And the more things that are on that side, the more options you have that you can use. Okay, so one thing, if I've got parentheses in this problem with something outside of parentheses, that generally means to distribute. So I'm going to take each term in these parentheses, remember terms are split by a plus or minus, and I'm going to multiply times sine. So it's distributive property. So sine times cotangent, okay, plus sine times cosine times tangent. That's one way to start. It's not the only thing we could have done, but that's just one thing. So if you see parentheses, maybe you can multiply. Okay, now if I look at this function, I have 4 different trig functions up here. I've got sine, cotangent, cosine, and tangent. 4 is a lot to work with at once. So let's change everything that's not sine or cosine into sines and cosines. So I'm going to leave the first part as sine of x, but for cotangent, if you look on your identity page, the reciprocal or the quotient identity for cotangent is cosine over sine. Now how do you know what to use? Again, practice, practice, practice. And since that one's a fraction, I'm going to put the sine over 1. Okay, on the second part, sine is okay, so let's put it over 1. Cosine is fine, let's put it over 1. But tangent, let's change that. And the quotient identity for tangent is sine over cosine. Again, there are other things we could substitute for tangent, but since we had sines and cosines in the problem, this will give us more options. Okay, now if I'm multiplying 2 fractions together and I have the same thing on top and bottom, I can cancel. So I'm going to cancel the sines from the first set and the cosines on the second set. Okay, which leaves me on the first part with cosine of x plus, and that's cosine over 1, but you don't have to write over 1. On the other side, I've got sine times sine, which is sine squared over 1, or just sine squared. Now, look at what we were trying to get for our answer. It matches, so we're finished. The work is important. Do not skip any steps.